So I'm going to start off with a bit of my background. So my background is I'm an engineer. I've also done an MBA and I've worked in the corporate world. So I'm an older mum. I've worked in the corporate world for probably 30 odd years. I've worked in multiple different industries like manufacturing, automotive, IT, telecoms, financial industry, insurance, etc., etc. I only have one child. Bucky's 11. So a lot of what I'm talking about is based on his personal preferences as well as, my experience parenting a single child. But having said that, I've also mixed, like, because the Sydney homeschooling community is so large, I would have had regular contact with 100+ kids, when I was in Sydney. And obviously, a lot of different families. And it's such a great community. So there's a lot of sharing of ideas, sharing of approach, sharing of your experiences, what works, what didn't, and sharing of resources. And also the thing I found really wonderful was there's no right or wrong in this, and no one's trying to control you. So you might go to a meetup and social meetup, and you have families with completely different viewpoint on how education should occur, but your kids play fine and you discuss it fine. Because, no one's really interested in anyone else other than their own family and what's good for them. So I found that really refreshing.
I do have a question here. Like you say, there's no right or wrong, but isn't it quite heavily regulated in what you have to teach a kid, like certain levels that you need to get them to, certain things that they need to learn, etc. Like
Okay, so
there's a
this is the downside of recording this. But anyway, so in Sydney, what I found was I arrived, I assumed I have to do the curriculum, and New South Wales is quite strict. So when I met people, and there are people traveling internationally, et cetera, they just said, don't register. So if you don't want the government involved, don't register. So that's exactly what I did. So he's 11. We registered him 2 months ago for the first time. I would say it's quite heavily regulated, but I homeschool families are incredibly inventive in how they tick those boxes. So we have people who do complete unschooling, don't follow the curriculum, and then they collect a whole pile of stuff, present it in a way that's acceptable to the government. ACT is totally different. They know that you've chosen homeschooling for a very particular reason, and that just might be that your kid doesn't cope with school. So they think that the most important thing then is to improve their emotional well-being, not focus on academics. So if you disregarded their emotional well-being and focused only on academics, they'd actually be asking a question, what are you doing? Because, so it's very different. Different states have different rules and rigor, and ACT is definitely the slackest. So we're quite lucky we're registered here. So the other consideration is obviously Australian law. So there are a couple of schools around the world that I actually love. So there's one in the UK and one in Massachusetts in the US, which I've studied pretty extensively, and I'd be quite happy for Bucky to go to those schools. But those schools aren't available here. So I kind of became a reluctant homeschooler. I didn't want to homeschool, but I wasn't happy with the school system here and the outcome it produces. And there's also, I guess, a few principles around education, or what I believe education is, and homeschool allowed me to be able to do that. So once I've decided to homeschooling, now I've got to work out, well, what's my actual approach? So I've rejected the school system. It's like, well, now what do I do? How do I approach this? So for me, it was really helpful to address 3 questions. The first question I had to think about is, what's a child? So it's a really basic, fundamental question, but that will actually determine your approach. So when Bucky arrived, I was told that he's a blank canvas, and I kind of just didn't really believe that. You think of their body, their body is already capable of doing a whole pile of things to make sure they survive. And so I didn't really believe the blank mind, and my husband and I call it him downloading. And there's actually some really interesting stories about kids having knowledge that they absolutely shouldn't. And I'll give you a quick example. It's kind of a sad example, but there was a kid in New York. She was about 11, and she started drawing all these images in her journal. And the parents are like, couldn't recognize them, couldn't work out where she learnt this, because this is quite many years ago, before the internet. And anyway, unfortunately she died, and they went to like a professor to try and work out, where do these symbols come from, because their friends and family had no idea. And it turned out to be very ancient symbols of death. And it's so to me, and that's just one example, but there's lots of stories, and I even have lots of examples with Bucky where he knew something that he probably shouldn't on. So to me, it's like almost like he arrives with this sort of capability to adapt to his environment, but also maybe some ancient knowledge. I don't know. That's how I saw it. The second question,
Bone-chilling
what's that?
story. That was just bone-chilling, that story.
You know,
I was
it's
gonna
sad.
say.
The parents, like, the kid didn't even know what it was. It's just coming into her mind, and the parents didn't know, and it's quite sad, you know.
Actually, pretty
Don't you think
consistent
it's
with.
also you go, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of overlap between the kind of things Jung says about archetypes and the way that we sort of see, say, modern neural networks work. I mean, your genes have encoded a mechanism for producing a learning machine, but there's certainly a lot of latent knowledge in that learning machine. We know in animals that's true, right? Many birds are born knowing how to perform very specific behaviors. Many animals are like that. So the brain is clearly not a blank slate. It's a question of what knowledge is in there. And for a social animal like ourselves, it's entirely conceivable that there's quite deep, actually, kind of knowledge about all sorts of things that's programmed into us, and whether or not it takes symbolic form is an
The
empirical
other
question.
example is personality, right? Because it's not just about information. I mean, I believe that everyone understands that their baby has some kind of personality, and I think that this is studied psychologically as well. That extremely, extremely young, like even still inside the fetus, sometimes there's like evidence of
Inside the
personality.
womb, you mean?
Sorry, inside the womb, as it's I've had not enough sleep. So as a fetus inside the womb, there's evidence of personality. So I think that's also like evidence that they're not a blank slate. But being told they're a blank slate is like pretty silly, in my opinion. When you say you were told, do you mean by the medical professional?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And also, you know, education tends to approach it like that. You know, you just pour information in, and of course they absorb information, but otherwise they're blank. And I'm like, anyway, that's my personal opinion. That wasn't my experience, and I don't believe that. So of course it altered the way I, you know, approached it. The second question, which I found essential to address, was what's a good education? Just that, like, you know, you could debate that for hours, right? So what I arrived at after observing and much thought was like the education's the one that you wanted, when you wanted it, and to the depth that you needed it at the time. So if you had a question or you're curious, you know, your answer to your satisfaction, or in the case of a child, until you're bored and you move on. I mean, I've seen Bucky asked, you know, Dad a question, and halfway through he's already walked off. So he's obviously satisfied or bored and he's moved on. And yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you repeat that list again?
Oh, what's a child?
No, the like when you want to know it,
So
what
sorry.
you want to.
So what you want to know, when you want to know it, and to the depth that you need, you know, that satisfies you, basically. And also too, I think the second element of education, and also if you want to go off exploring things, you know, often kids here know a lot, especially when they're young, but if they want to go off exploring things, that they're allowed or facilitated to go off and explore it, again, till they're satisfied or bored. And the second part of education, which I think is really neglected, is a kid knowing themselves at every stage. So, and I get this from Sudbury Valley, the US school, because if you are, you know, a lot of parents say, you know, to kids, I think sillily, but what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's like, you know, obviously they can't answer that, but I think a kid should be able to at least answer the question, who are you now and what are you interested in? And, you know, what's important to you, or what excites you, whatever. And so if you've got this child that can fully explore things, then they're pretty clear about who they are and what's important to them and what they're interested in. And then the third question I had to kind of address was, what does success look like? So now, how do I know I'm sort of on the right path? And also as an adult, because, you know, obviously we spend much longer as an adult than a child. So it's really important that you set up your child for being a successful adult. And for now, the way I kind of look at it is, if they're still curious, they're still experimenting, they've still got this spirit, you know, they're very animated, whatever. I think you're basically relatively on the right path. And in terms of an adult, I think if you're doing something that's of most interest to you and you can do, and you've got an independent living, then that's success as an adult. So,
Would you say what you mean by independent living? I mean, obviously you don't mean like economic independence, or at least not only that. It's like some kind of...
Yeah, so this, and again, it comes back to personal definition, but basically I would say that, you know, you can support yourself, your family, if you want one, and, you know, if you want a home, you can buy a home, or, you know, the certain lifestyle that you want. So if you're able to support that and also do what you're passionate about, that to me is success as an adult. And obviously lifestyle will vary greatly depending on the person. But an interesting thing I discovered was in the US, so pre the Industrial Revolution, if you were educated, you would never work for someone. So if you'd have your own business. If you were a professional lawyer, whatever, you had your own practice and people worked for you. And that's what they considered a well-educated person. And I find that really quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so unless it's your choice to work for someone, of course, it's entirely dependent on your choice. But they would, yeah, an educated person always worked for themselves in the US.
I think this is a very telling comment. I mean, if I have one worry, not exactly a worry, but I mean, I'm a fairly crotchety person who finds it very difficult to take instructions from anybody. And I can barely survive in a university where, compared to other institutions, I'm left more or less alone. And I can see my son is very much like this. And homeschool, this is going to be like blossom even further than it is in myself. I mean, he better be able to like work for himself or run a business. I think he might find it even more difficult to tolerate bullshit than I do. So like the ability, I mean, but in different periods and different times, it has been easier or less easy to actually do that, right? It's maybe less easy to start your own business than in the past. I'm not sure if that's true, but my parents both ran small businesses, so it's kind of consistent. But do you worry or that you're kind of closing off, I mean, by promoting someone to really be very intellectually independent, you might close off some opportunities? I don't personally worry about that because I kind of don't wish that life on him, but there are parts of the world that you kind of do, maybe even valuable places to be, certain institutions or whatever, where a high tolerance for that might be a skill.
Yeah, possibly. And I think, look, if that's very important to them to be there at that university, then you know, they'll adapt. If that's, you know, so again, it's sort of up to them to work out. But yeah, there's a lot of discussion around preparing children for the world. And I honestly think that if you're, you know, satisfied throughout your life, and you're satisfied within yourself and you're doing something you love, there's a lot of stuff you're willing to take on board, you know, bullshit or whatever, to be able to accommodate that, basically, or enable that. So, But yeah, I mean, you know, all of the stuff all my approach I worry about, to be honest. The proof will be in the pudding. Right?
Yeah.
So those three questions about what is a child good education that's success. So the reason I found them important is because if you don't get that clear, you're continually swayed by external forces like the media or, you know, someone trying to sell you something, or your family, friends, or you're driven by fear or doubt. So so that's why I thought it was really important. So the next part I'm going to go through is I've got like 6 to 7 kind of what I call guiding principles So these are not absolute. You've got to use your wisdom, obviously, but I find it useful to kind of anchor yourself into something. I have found it useful. So the first principle that I kind of abide by is putting a kid in the world to learn about the world. So if you think of a school, the school system, from a very young age, kids are taken out of the world, put into a classroom, and they're taught about the world, in the classroom. So what we did for, the first 3 years of his homeschooling, we were out in the world all the time, every single day. So we went to like mines, factories, construction sites. We went to people's work, which I thought was pretty cool, like Dad's work. We did our tour of the ABC in Sydney, which was pretty cool. We went foraging down the coast. We went to theatre, concerts. We walked all over ships. We went to the bush. We went to farms, explored caves, even things like display villages, where they design homes, shops. Like, you go to Bunnings and you just go through every aisle and explain what everything's for. And we lived in Brisbane, Canberra and Sydney. So we literally went to everything that they have on offer, pretty much outside all the time, meeting with people, overhearing conversations. It sometimes isn't for the faint-hearted because they overhear and see a lot. So they see prostitution, drugs, you can imagine they've seen everything. Now, of course, you can do this with your school kid, but it requires a lot of time and energy, and not many people have the time of energy to work, send their kid to school, and then on the weekend go out and do all this. So I'm not really doing anything new, but we're dedicating our entire day to this sort of learning. And I think it actually is good, particularly for younger kids. So I'll talk about this a bit later, but there's like a coming of age between 12 to 14 where their brain shifts and their method of learning shifts. But particularly for young children, to have very tangible things is of main interest to them. And particularly I found this with Bucky. And so if you go out and they pretty much understand the world around them completely, even like in the home, like how carpet's made or how you construct a house, but basically this satisfied him, and we spent about 3 years doing it. Unfortunately, the downside of this is the world's not very set up for it. So we lived in the centre of Sydney, and he'd be like, well, what's in that building? Can we go have a look? I'm like, actually, we don't have a pass for that building. Or we wanted to go to the fish market and learn how the trucks come in. It's like, because of health and safety rules, we couldn't see the behind the scenes. Same with Sydney Opera House. They do a front tour and they do a behind the scenes tour, and you have to be 16. And the Toyota factory, you have to be 16. So there's a lot of constraints on learning. We'd pass a construction site. He'd like, can I go in and look at that digger and see how it works? No, we can't because of health and safety. So a lot of the world is off limits. Going to the airport, again, you can't go underneath and see how the baggage handling works. So these are the questions and the things that he asked me to do. But so there's a lot of saying no because the world is not set up for this at all. And one of the other things...
sorry, Billy. So what would you do in those situations? Would you just find a YouTube video explaining it, or
so we went to as many... Sorry, Will. Yeah, so we went to as many factories as I could find. And then we watched 31 seasons of How It's Made, which is a Canadian show. He's obsessed with how everything's made. 31 seasons. So you just have to make do. But in terms of his satisfaction and his comprehension, it's best to obviously see it in real life if you can.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And you would have learnt tons doing all of this as well, right? Like, not even just about homeschooling and about Bucky. Like, surely you gained heaps of more information.
Yeah,
So
I did.
heaps of new information. I've lost the ability to speak.
Yeah, I did, definitely. But to be honest, sometimes things that he's interested in, I wasn't. So, for example, for 3 months, he's interested in vacuum cleaners. I'm like, it's just like, okay. And then like 3 months later, he started being interested in space and infinity. So obviously I can't go into outer space. So I've got to watch videos on that. And then after that, he was really fascinated with my family and my upbringing. probably working out why I'm so screwed up. Yeah, so yeah. So, we'd pass a construction site again and stop again. And I'm just like, oh, for God's sake.
How
Yeah.
quickly did he get into um questions like your family and your background? Because that seems more theoretical to me, right? It's kind of like a child has an interest in physical stuff. They're touching the carpet and the sand and the dirt.
Yeah.
But like, is there any interesting point to be made about a transition from once they've seen a lot of the world into like a more theoretical interest
Yeah, look, I
or abstract might be
again,
a
I
better.
can only speak from my experience, but he was interested in the space and infinity and my family at age 5. So
Yeah.
that to me was a little bit earlier than I was expecting. And other kids aren't interested in that stuff till later. So it's very individual, but he's still like he's 11 now and he's still really interested in physical things. So yeah, mixed with, thinking about broader things. So I was,
Yeah.
yeah, stuck in there. So the second principle I have was around self-directed learning, so following the interests. So I've sort of talked a bit about that, but basically, um, I felt like, he has a right to what information goes in his mind when he wants it and the depth to which he wants it. So back to that education definition. So my job is to expose him to a whole pile of stuff. And then when he shows an interest, and then, facilitate that interest. I'll give you a quick example. We went to the ballet. He loved it. And then, so I enrolled him in ballet classes. Unfortunately, it was full of screaming girls and he hated it. And so we stopped it. But that's just an example of something he wasn't aware of that existed. And as soon as he found out about it, he wanted to participate in that. Yeah, so my job, I'm, a lot of facilitation. And as I said, there's some things that I just can't provide. So one of the things he wanted to do at one point was in his head, there was this like what he called a drill ship. So it's like a cylinder that had a drill head on the thing and you live in it and it goes down into the ground and drills up through. And I'm like, and he wanted us to build it. I'm like, I can't. And he's like, well, find someone else who can. I'm like, yeah, to get someone to engineer that will probably cost 50K. So,
I
yeah, we
like I
can't do
like how
that.
you sort of tried very hard. Yeah, if I might share one anecdote, Russell, one day, my son, he knows I do physics and mathematics and so on. So he thought I should be able to build a teleporter, right? And so he comes up to me and he's like, okay, build me a teleporter. And then I said, sorry, I can't do that. But what he heard was, I'm not willing to do that because I'm doing this other thing. Like,
Yeah,
he was actually really angry at me for being able to
exactly.
not building him a teleporter. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had this like rule too, like, to always say yes when he asks for something. I'm not talking about eating cookies. We're very strict about health and safety, but I'm talking about any activity. I always try to say yes and then work out how to do it. And I think after I remember one day distinctly, and Chris comes home from work, and I'm like in tears, and I'm like, he wants me to build like a tower up to the ceiling, and we had cathedral ceilings. I'm like, I'm done. I've had it. It's impossible. I can't satisfy this child. So yeah, as I said, a few fails along the way, So with the self-directed learning and following interests, so there's a few kind of, I'm not myths, but there's a few discussion points around this. So people think that if you just do whatever you want, whenever you want, that when you grow up and you have to kind of transition into adolescence, that there's a whole pile of stuff that you'll have to catch up on, or you won't be able to transition effectively. I'll just give you a quick anecdote from the school in America, the Sudbury Valley. So they have they don't have any classes unless you request them. They almost don't have any teachers. They're in this unique situation where they're between Yale, Harvard, and Wharton, and it was founded by a physics professor, and it's a smallish private school. So they have 17 staff members, only 2 of which are actual teachers. But they're really good at facilitating kids' interests. So, for example, there's this kid, a girl who wanted to do, I can't remember which degree she wanted to do, but it required, the highest level maths of school. And the last time she'd ever looked at maths was when she was 6 years old. And so what they did was set her up with a maths professor, and he started tutoring her. So she was like 2-3 years out from uni, but decided that that's what she wanted to work towards now. When they put her with this tutor, he was appalled. He thought, what the hell are these people doing? This is disgraceful. She knows nothing, right? But because it had a very, they met, I think, once a week for an hour, and then he'd give her a whole pile of homework. And because, because it was self-directed learning, she could dedicate quite a lot of her week towards maths at this moment. Anyway, after 6 months, she'd pretty much caught up to like year 10 level. And then within the year, she had caught up to his students. And in fact, she was quite a bit better than his students. Now, I've told this story before, and they're like, oh, well, she was probably just good at maths. Now, they have thousands of examples like this. When you provide context and a purpose, and you give the child time to really master something, they really get focused and knuckle down and really learn it, really focused on learning it. So after this experience, this guy was a total convert. He's like, okay, I don't think that school's crap anymore. So
can I push back a little? So obviously, so maybe here we might disagree on something. So I think there is a distribution of cognitive ability. I don't think everybody's the same. And maybe the students at this school coming from professors from all these neighboring universities are not average children. Do you think that this approach, and yeah, I mean, discussions about this kind of thing are controversial for good reason, but I think well-meaning people, in my opinion, can make the mistake of thinking everybody's like them. I mean, so if you're highly educated and very cognitively capable, and then you think that the student in front of you is failing because they're just not trying hard enough. But for some people, it's just, I mean, having taught many, many students calculus, I would say that, in my opinion, for some people, it's not just a matter of effort or concentration or will. There's just, people have limits, and as people who value human life, you should be working out what they can do within their limits and not pushing them outside of them and making them torture themselves. So how do you reconcile that with an approach that says, yeah, if you have 2 years left to learn math, it's all good?
Well, first of all, you don't have to go to university when you're 18. And so I think there's plenty of time, and they have many, like they've been going since 1969, 68, around there. And they don't just have professors' children, they do have a lot of, local people in the area who, the janitors' children, whatever. There's also the Summerhill in the UK, which has been going since the 1920s. So they have a very, excuse me, Sudbury Valley School's a copy of the UK school. And so I read a lot of testimonials because I was really interested in how the kids turn out. So I would say that whether that child started learning maths at 5 or they started learning it as, more of an adolescent, they probably wouldn't make it into that degree anyway. Like you say, some people just have a natural aptitude. So whether they try and learn it earlier or later, there's not much, they probably will have a roughly the same outcome. And I think the other thing I found, so I also read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and his family was very poor. They could only afford to send one child to school. It was him. He did school for 2 years. He failed math abysmally, and then age 12 he taught himself math. And again, people might say, well, he was just naturally intelligent, but he's already failed math. Then he taught himself math because he was apprenticed in his brother's company. They had a printing company, and he was tasked with sort of running the numbers of the business. So he picked it up quite quickly. They have had many, many children learning math later. And what they found too is that an adult mind picks it up, and not an adult mind, but a post-pubescent mind picks it up much faster than a kid does. So they get concepts much abstract concepts much faster. So and again, like this is like a principle. and then you go back to your own child. The fact is, Bucky has picked up math. He's not interested in maths at all. He thinks Will is insane. But when I first thought I had to do the curriculum, I did do some maths with him, and he was picking up concepts really quickly. So it's not applicable to my situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, people are very effective learners when they're motivated, and maybe waiting for the motivation to appear is an effective method.
And also when they're given the time, I think like the focus. So, you see kids and they're switching content all the time during a day. Whereas if you just, when you are doing your math, you're spending hours on it. So it's your mind is sort of progressing rather than, switching in and out all the time. You're like, come back to your maths lesson like, oh, what the hell did I learn last week? I can't remember. So, yeah, the fact that she was able to focus on it. But as I said, it's just one story, but there's a lot of, you just do a whole pile of research and work out what you believe is best. So that's what I did. The other thing I would say is that's the second thing is that if you allow a child to do anything, there's a theory that they won't try anything difficult. And again, these schools have found that that's not true because there's really no consequence to failing. So they've had very young kids, wanting to learn how to launch a rocket. So not only make one, build one, learn the maths associated with trajectories and these sorts of things. And they found the opposite, that they're quite willing to try almost anything because there's really no consequence to failure. No consequence such as failure, sorry. And the other thing that I was really clear on was not having pre-designated learning outcomes associated with an activity. Now, because we're registered, we now have to tick off the curriculum. Everything has a learning outcome. Even play has a learning outcome these days. And I think it's really important to not interfere with their process of understanding, reasoning, observing. So I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. He was very interested, as I said, in space and infinity. I took him to a planetarium. So it was this domed roof, and we had a projector. It was an old style projector where they had the three lights. I think they're called CRT projectors. And, they combined to make this beautiful pattern on the ceiling. And they were showing the night sky, and they're talking about the solar system. And we were there for probably 40 minutes. Now, when the projection finished, a lot of the school kids were asking about the night sky and the solar system because that's why they were brought there, to learn about that. Anyway, Bucky puts up his hand and he's asking all about the projector. And that he was absolutely fascinated with the projector. How can a projector make those colors, make those patterns, display on a dome roof? And how's the dome roof made? So he was asking all these questions about the projector. Absolutely fascinated by it. So to me, I'm like, well, I went there to learn about space, but he learned about projectors. So, that's fine. And there's another classic example, like a guy who he was an art teacher. So he went, this is overseas in Europe. So he took them to see the great, the Dutch masters, hoping they would really be inspired by this. And then, when it came to question time, after they toured, one of the kids' fascination with the shiny floors. And they're so easy to slide on. And how do you get them so shiny and flat? It's like, okay, well, that's what he got out of it. That's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think about, many parents are extremely concerned about screen time. I tend to disagree with many of my colleagues about that. Russell isn't stuck to a screen or addicted to it. We've had a sort of, I would say, healthy relationship with computers his entire life. But I think there is some truth to the fact that there are some experiences out there that are kind of like addictive or really manipulative, right? Like they will be a certain kind of moving image that's not, I would say, something I'd like him to do for hours on end. Now, he's actually not really attracted to those things, maybe because he's not forbidden them. But how do you think about managing traps, like attention traps or things like that? Do you even believe they exist, or do you
Yeah, no,
think?
I definitely believe they exist, and we've had firsthand experience of that. So, there's a few parents, and I was one of them, that just thought, well, he can do everything he wants. And then I noticed that he was like basically grumpy, dissatisfied, almost angry. And so, because he spent all his time on the screen. And so, but I talked to him about it. I said, I'm limiting your screen time because I've observed that you're actually dissatisfied. And he agreed. And so, Chris and I, you don't want anyone else to raise your child. You don't want the internet to raise your child. So, we've had many discussions. So, we do have some light restrictions. And one of them is around screen time. And it's purely because it was making him unhappy and he was getting addicted. The funny thing is that we had YouTube, free YouTube, and they have ads. And then the first thing we did was, pay for it so we don't get the ads. Because he was coming out to me and saying things like, Mum, if you apply this cream, your wrinkles go away.
Yeah,
He believed everything he was told. I'm like, yeah, I really can't make my wrinkles go away.
yeah, paying for YouTube is a requirement, I think.
Absolutely.
Parent, yeah.
Yeah, so no, there are some kids who don't get addicted. I think most do, and I think so that's been our practical application is sorry, but we are going to limit it, and this is the reason why we're limiting it, and that's what we do.
Yeah,
And there's also
sorry to interrupt you. So it sounds a little bit like you're kind of like almost lucky that Billy's like, oh, sorry, that Bucky says, "Oh yeah, I agree, and I can see that it's making me unhappy, and like let's limit this." I mean, if your child got to a point where they had an addiction to a particular video game that featured like some kind of like play schooled gambling or something, like they might genuinely have a proper addiction, and then you're trying to get them off it, like they're going to like it's going to be a massive deal. So what would you do in that kind of a situation if it did happen to get to a point where they were genuinely addicted to something? Then what?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but I think we have been at that point. And so, you're a parent, they're a child, you can, you could switch off the internet. I mean, we have never switched off the internet, but we certainly would do if it came to that. Like he was up in the middle of the night sneaking in, videos and stuff, then we would do that. So as I said, we're really light on any sorts of constraints around what he wants to educate himself on, but we're quite strict about health and safety. And that's because he's a child and he might not know better. So
would you explain that to your child? Because
yes.
what would you expect to happen if you explain to like, a 7 or 8 year old the nature of addiction and that you're going to go through like 2 weeks of extreme discomfort, but you will feel better after that? Like, would you explain all of this and then do it and then cut them off and then have them backlash very severely?
Yeah, I definitely would tell him that. We always explain everything we're doing and why. He doesn't always accept it, but we try to be as honest and straightforward as possible. So then when he's feeling crap, he at least understand that there's a reason, and we're not being mean or, we're not just because mum said or whatever. And, I think every kid's been addicted to sugar at some point. So I've literally had him screaming at me, I want sugar. And I'm like, well, sorry, you're not getting any because you're clearly addicted. And the same with the screen, like when we first started limiting screen time, there was this really difficult transition after he came off the screen where he's like lying on the floor, depressed, I'm bored, all this stuff. But now, because we've consistently had that rule, now he gets off and within 10 minutes he's into something else. So it's a pretty quick transition now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other principle I have is around again, this is similar to being in the world, but first-hand experiences as much as possible. So obviously when you're in school, there's a lot of like paper-based learning, you a lot of theory, you're watching a lot of videos, textbooks and things. But we try to put our hands on the clay, so to speak, as much as possible. So I'll give you some quick examples like there was a boat show on in Sydney, and we went to it, and he noticed there was a gyroscope on one of the ships, so we're invited on. And he went out into the harbour, and he was taught how to drive it via satellite and how to drive it manually and stuff like that. So we try to get as many first-hand experiences as possible. And one of the homeschool mums, she was a trained actor, so a stage actor, so you're in the theatre. And she said something really interesting, and I really took it on board, which was, as an actor, your body and your mind is your instrument. So the first thing they master before they do anything else is their body, how they present, their movement, but also what's in their head. Because if you're on live stage and something stuffs up or someone forgets their line or whatever, you have to be really mentally present in the moment. So they kind of train like that before they do any extension to props or working with other people, or like you might learn how to move your body, dance or whatever, before you then have a partner, that sort of thing. I found that really interesting. And the whole point of this is so that if you master, so for example, if you have a thought and you're immediately allowed to articulate it, and you articulate it and you're satisfied, it's about, not feeling self-conscious physically or mentally. It's about, how people have discussions and they're like, oh, I wish I said that, or I didn't think of that. Or they get dominated in a conversation, or they react in a way that they don't like, or they don't want to, or whatever like that. So again, it goes back to that's how actors are trained. And I thought that was really interesting for a kid. So when they enter school, there's a lot of you obviously can't have 25 kids talking in a classroom expressing every idea that comes into their head. You have to get them writing, or at least putting that aside for later, or memorizing it for when their turn comes up. But if you are homeschooling, you can do that. So you can have them be very articulate before they learn to actually express that differently through writing or drawing or that sort of thing. Mm. Yeah, so that's one thing we try to do as much as possible. The other thing we try to do as much as possible is what I would call bringing your own ideas to fruition versus consuming other people's ideas. So I'll just give you a quick example of what that means. So making up your own music or songs or your own play or character or story or whatever, versus doing Shakespeare. Shakespeare is wonderful, and of course, I think everyone should read it and perhaps perform it. But to me, there's too much weight on consuming other people's ideas, and not enough weight or time or space given to children to actually bring their original ideas into being, making up their own play or whatever, making up their own props, their own character, their own costumes, that sort of thing. So we try to enable a lot of time and space for him to be able to do that. Now, of course, consuming other people's ideas is really helpful. As I said, doing Shakespeare, because you do need a toolkit. Obviously, if you're going to come up with a story or even write an original story, you have to have language, you have to have grammar. If you're going to do art, you obviously have to understand how to work with tools, or you have to understand how to work with different materials. You need technique. So I don't have any issue with other people's ideas, but I just feel like if you look at the school system, from morning till night, they're pretty much consuming other people's ideas, even reading books. So things that people think are great for kids, and I think reading is great for children, but it's someone else's story, it's someone else's idea. So we try to, get him to express himself and then, bring it to fruition as much as possible. The next principle I have, and this is actually quite controversial, it won't be here, but for some parents it's hard. The other thing I do is I think he has a right to a childhood. So I'm not sure who decided we need to incarcerate 5-year-olds and dress them up as accountants and teach them work and give them a boss and break times and, all this sort of stuff. But someone has decided that. And it's funny because if you go to Africa, you see children dressed up in mining kit and they go down the mines of work, and we're just like horrified, but we have these little accountant kids doing hard work that they find stressful.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think if an alien landed on planet Earth, I'm not sure if they'd see the difference between those two scenarios. So I decided anyway that I wanted to give him an actual childhood. So if he was playing, I would never interrupt it, no matter how ridiculous or silly. I would just let him play. And basically, if you look at traditional cultures, and also pre the Industrial Revolution, there was a sort of a coming of age between 12 and 13. And so I sort of thought, my viewpoint is, if he plays until he's about 12, I really don't care. And then from 12 to 14,
Specifically with other kids?
what was that?
Is play specifically with other kids,
No,
or
anything, going out. If he just walked out in the garden and started digging, I'm like, oh, well, that's fine.
Right, okay.
So just play however he wants, play with other kids. And actually, he does love socializing and playing with other kids. So that means I am out a lot with other kids in parks. I mean, there is a park in Sydney where they constructed this entire base camp, which had a kitchen and all sorts of things. And that's where they play every week. And they're same with, we attend a thing called Bush Kids, where they're climbing trees and doing stuff like that. So yeah, I feel like I've decided that I wanted to give him a proper childhood where there's no responsibility, no adult life. Now, some people object to this because they think they have to prepare him for adult life, or that they won't have any idea what adult life is like. And I'm like, well, they see grumpy dad coming home from work every night, and they're already trying to plot how to not be like him. So they know what reality is. They see it daily. They see it in their parents. Parents are stressed about finances and et cetera, et cetera. So as I said, he knows what reality is. He's like, okay.
Also, how many years do you need to prepare anyway? It's like, do you really need 12 years to prepare?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Billy, Will said you're going to say some controversial things. So when does that start?
probably next.
Probably next.
No, actually, I've toned it down since I talked to Will.
I tried to tell Billy not to do that. No. Like, come on, say it. Say what you're comfortable saying, but you don't need to shy away.
I'm very opinionated, but so the next principle, the way I approach, so when he wants to learn something, like a theory of knowledge or a body of knowledge, I find that, I don't know whether this is the way that they teach children or the way kids interpret what they're being taught, but they basically learn things as absolute facts. Now, I do believe in the absolute, but I don't think we can really see it. Meaning, from planet Earth, from Billy's perspective, I have a very limited view of the absolute. I don't really see reality. I see my perception of reality. So unless I can go, outside the universe and look at it as an overall system, or I'm actually the mastermind of the universe, I don't think I can see the absolute. So whenever we talk about anything, so it could be anything, it could be religion, science, whatever, I explain it is, this is a theory of knowledge or a body of knowledge. So there's a body of evidence. And also, there's a belief that, we all have this consensus about how everything is, whereas there's so many different theories that contradict each other. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of that, like Tesla versus Edison, Darwin versus Watson. There's evidence in ancient buildings that there was a metric system in existence 2,000 years ago or however many years ago, but there are actual dimensions that exactly match the metric system, which is apparently only invented, 2 centuries ago or whenever it was. There's a lot of competing viewpoints or bodies of knowledge. So whenever he asks me about something, I kind of explain it from that point of view, because I don't want him to ever think this is an absolute fact, indisputable, and don't stop thinking or don't start looking for new evidence. Because what the outcome of this is, people, even though there's new evidence presented in front of them, they just disregard it because it doesn't fit in the absolute truth that they believe or have been taught. Of course, you have to be really vigilant about body of evidence because there's so much misinformation, agenda. I found this almost the most difficult part of homeschooling, is there's just so much bullshit out there. So we try to go to who was the original inventor, or looking at people who've been banned, or people who've been raided by the FBI. I don't know. There's a whole pile of things where we just go, okay, people who haven't been published as well as people who have been published. So we look at a whole pile of evidence. Also, too, I think it's really important for him to work out what constitutes evidence and proof. I have my own very strong views about this. And so someone outside of me will say, well, this is absolute, fact. This is the evidence, the body of evidence. And I'm like, well, I totally disagree with that. And I think that's an individual right, is working out what do you think is true. And so my job as a parent is to at least present what I think is like original or good quality, or curate it to some degree so that they're not reading trash, just on the internet or something.
I guess that drags in a lot of social questions rather earlier than they would be encountered in the normal system, because, I mean, of course, society has a lot of fictions that even many adults believe, and
Absolutely.
which are, I mean, they have some value. It makes it easier to live in the world if you don't see through the veil of the convenient fiction. I suppose it's. Do you think of it as a burden to be exposed to that early, or is it just like,
No. I don't know whether it's a burden. Sorry, yes, I do think it's a burden when you're at odds with your own society. And, it's particularly as a child, it's more confronting. Fortunately, as I said, in the homeschool community, there's a much broader range of philosophies and things. So, and also I do that on purpose. So it's like, I believe this, but this other family has a totally different opinion. I think it's very important for him to be exposed to that as well. And I also try to honor what he believes in. But if it's based on garbage, I will tell him outright that is just, in my opinion, total garbage. That theory, or that source of information. He gets actually quite pissed off about it because he has friends, and he just wants to be normal sometimes. And my husband and I didn't set out to be contrary to society. It just happens on almost every point, including the food you eat, medicine, all sorts of things. We are contrary to society, and he gets a bit annoyed about that, and he would like to just be normal sometimes.
Yeah.
But I see it as a responsibility so that he's not conned, so he doesn't ruin his own life. And second of all, because I want him to be able to reason properly. So to look at a body of look at a body of evidence and decipher if that's good quality, or what does that actually mean, or is there an agenda behind that, to detect those sorts of things. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, this seems like one of the more difficult ones to me. I don't know that so I think it's there's a cognitive load to being contrary, right?
There is, yeah.
And you pay a price, especially over years and years. And it seems hard to sign somebody up for that. But on the other hand, I also feel like it's illegitimate to hide from someone knowledge about the world that they want and that you have. And if that is that the nature of society is not what it seems, then I feel like it would be negligent for me to not answer that question as well as I could.
Exactly. And you have to, I do take in consideration what he can handle. So, for example, I was very clear, we're out all the time in parks in Sydney, which sometimes border, major roads. So I'd say to him, don't go out. Basically, the homeschool kids range to a certain level. But basically, there has to be a limit to that, because people do snatch children. And I made it very clear that that's what happens, and from a very early age, and that you would never see me again. So he pays attention to what I'm saying. But I never told him what would happen if he did get snatched, because that's too much.
Did he ask?
No, just not seeing me again was enough to scare the shit out of him.
Yeah. makes sense.
Sorry, but I do not want him to wander off to the toilets, which happen to be bordering a car park in the main road, you know. So he's very clear that he shouldn't do that. And his friends, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, so yeah, but he does get sick of being at odds with everyone.
With that point, I was going to say, I'm not sure if there's so much you can do as a parent if you just are contrary. Like you didn't, as you said, you didn't make that decision, right? You just
No.
built your own body of knowledge, and here you are. So it's like, what are you gonna do? Like not, like somehow, like artificially generate some normalcy for your child, which you don't even, you're not yourself, and you don't know how to, like, if you're not that, you don't really know what it is anyway. Like if I tried to be normal, like I wouldn't be able to do that authentically, and I wouldn't be able to generate that for my child anyway.
I
So I
know.
don't really.
And they are your child, you know, so it's not
Yeah.
like that they would be so different to you that, you know, it just doesn't work.
Mm.
So, you know, I think there is some compatibility there. It's just when you're a child, it's just like what you said right at the front, Stan, that, you know, you're letting your child sort of, they'll be even less tolerant of the bullshit of society. And the same with Bucky, you know, he's exposed to a lot more than I was at this age.
Or maybe if there were 1,000 times more intolerant people, society would be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have to finish? It's 6 o'clock. Are you guys finishing up now or?
I'm not in a rush, so yeah, it's if you have time, I'm happy to hear the rest of what you had to say.
Absolutely. So the next principle is really around correction of grammar or speech or facts. So when the kid gets it wrong and you know it's wrong. So a lot of people have this sort of nice notion of a master and apprentice, and the kid listens to everything you have because you're wise and you've got knowledge and all this sort of stuff. I found that actually creates a lot of resentment and it doesn't really work. And if you've ever told a child to shut a door, you're usually saying the same thing for 2 years straight over and over. So I don't think it actually works. So I try not to interfere, even though I know he's got that fact wrong, because kids are always assessing new knowledge, new evidence, reasoning more and more. So I think self-correction works much more effectively, one, in terms of their ability to reason, and second of all, in terms of the fact that the fact sticks in. So what makes sense to an 8-year-old brain no longer makes sense to an 11-year-old brain. So I found that if I just leave him be, again, you have to provide good resources, but if I just leave him be, he eventually gets the fact. He learns something as he grows up and sees new evidence or can understand it better or whatever. Same with the language. You know, I never used to correct him. But of course, my husband and I try to speak properly. We give him audio books that are well written. And then, you know, a year later, and then he's speaking correctly. So, yeah, a lot of parents don't really approach it like that. They're always correcting children, and we never correct him on anything almost, unless there was a health and safety issue, then we would. Yeah, so
I'm a bit confused about this one. So do you see this? I mean, clearly for a lot of parents, correcting a child is part of building the authority. So it's sort of, they tell themselves it's about education, and maybe often it is, but maybe it's hard for them to separate that from establishing themselves as the dominant person in the relationship. Are you more concerned here to like not really be sure you're not making that error? Or do you have a more positive view of the effect of like self-correction and learning to self-correct maybe?
Yeah, definitely the latter. I think it's really because, as I said, they're constantly observing, thinking, and I think that you can really interfere with that process if you correct them too much. Because if they understood it, they would already know it. So you telling them, and actually they don't believe you. You know, unless they see it or understand, they just don't believe you anyway. Like I've had discussions with Bucky where I know something's completely false, but he just absolutely refuses to budge on his opinion. And then, you know, 6 months later, he has the same thought as me, but I actually don't really, you know, I don't correct him. So, you know, I don't have that altercation with him.
Mm.
So do you never correct, or is it just rarely? So like if something was really
Rarely.
persistent, like yeah,
Only
okay.
rarely because, I'm a human, right? I get annoyed or sick of something, um, or if it's health and safety, even though he doesn't understand it, I will just, I will control his life in that aspect. So we are strict about health and safety things. So you don't understand how glyphosate, is damaging, to your body. However, I do. So therefore you're eating organic food. Sorry. And when he requests things at the supermarket that I know will be high in glyphosate, it's just a blank no. And then he'll repeatedly ask the question, why? And I'm like, why. I've explained it to you, but it just hasn't registered because he doesn't understand how glyphosate, you know, damages the body. But in some future some future time, he might understand how it damages the body.
Mm.
So him just taking my word for it, no, he won't take my word for it, but I don't care. You're a child and you're just not eating that. So, let's move on. But otherwise, if it's just general knowledge that doesn't affect his health or well-being, then of course I just leave it.
The question that's related to this, but feel free to come back to it later if it's sort of too much of a tangent. So one of the things I notice with older students, and like the biggest obstacle, in my opinion, to people learning is that they become very emotionally invested in, for example, being wrong. And they try very hard to avoid knowing that they're wrong. And if they're told they're wrong, they try very hard to avoid knowing exactly why. And it's like extremely painful to receive feedback and correct itself.
Yeah.
And the people I notice who learn extremely effectively are the people who are just don't care if they're wrong. I mean, they will notice they're wrong, thank you for noticing, and then move on. And this is a very difficult skill, I think, for most people. So I find myself sometimes with Russell, like trying to guide him to be less emotionally attached to being right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, that I'm a little unsure about where in his development this kind of lesson belongs, or whether I should really be stressing it as early as I am. Or do you have an opinion about? I mean, I don't want to push him to be less emotional or something like that, right? I'm not trying to say emotions are bad, but I think there is value to decoupling these like just learning to notice your emotional reactions during learning and separating them from knowledge itself. And I'm wondering if you have any opinion about whether that's a good idea or not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, so because I think that one of my other principles is that you must live these principles. So Chris and I are really good at admitting when we're wrong, always stuffed up, with him and with each other. So it's been quite fortunate in our household. It's quite easy to admit you're wrong or you don't know or whatever. I definitely didn't used to be like that. I used to hate, errors being pointed out. And there's probably a couple of things I still hate because it goes back to my childhood of feeling stupid and inferior or whatever. So I haven't had a lot of experience with like a strong emotional reaction to being wrong. But I have had some experience, and we just back off straight away because it just doesn't matter. Like what I'm saying is the fact that there's a reaction means whatever point you're trying to make is now no longer relevant, and you're now at odds with your child. And so I put my relationship with him above anything that lesson that I'm trying to, teach him or whatever. That's how I kind of approach it. Chris is a bit more, I'd say, severe than I am. We have probably a different relationship, but for me, I just back off pretty quickly. I want him to be able to come to me with anything. And I'm not just talking about learning. I'm talking about later on when he like crashes the car or, does something really stupid. You want to have that really comfortable space where I know I absolutely effed up and I want to talk to you. And we did have one recently. He knows about pornography and stuff, but he's never shown any interest because he's on the internet a lot. So, and he loves a lot of adult content. So it comes up as a possibility. And so it did come up. And so he went off and he was on his tablet for 10 minutes watching very graphic pornography or whatever. I didn't know about it. He came and told me.
Mm.
So he told me that he went and did this, and I was just like, so I had no reaction. It's just like, and what do you think? He goes, I didn't like it at all. I'm like, so you're going to do it again? He's like, I don't think so. And that's kind of it. That's how I handled that.
So why do you think that he came to talk to you about it?
Because we try to have the definition between parental consequences versus real life consequences. There are real life consequences when you can really stuff up your life. So he has treated me sometimes really badly, like, through the internet or whatever. Sometimes he's got, a pretty unhealthy view of women. Sometimes he's come out with, some of the gamers and stuff. So I've just told him blatantly, if you spoke how you just spoke to me, if you spoke to your girlfriend like that, you would no longer have a girlfriend. So I try to, let him know. Until he actually experiences that firsthand, he probably won't learn that. But try to be as honest with him as possible about that. And now I've forgotten your question. Sorry, Will.
But my question was, why do you think so? For instance,
Oh, why do you think? Yeah, sorry. Consequences versus, so true consequences are like you lost your girlfriend, you crashed the car, whatever. We try not to punish him for coming to us with almost anything. Like, I know, like when he went to school, the primary skill he learned at school was stealing. He said he was really good at it. And so he told us about that. And so I tried to explain to him that, people don't like stealers. You will not have friends, and try to explain what the consequence of it in the real world would be. But then ultimately it's up to him to steal or not. Now, if he stole something significant and he ended up with a police record, I might intervene. But this is inconsequential. You'll just piss off a few people. You'll end up in the principal's office. You might lose a few friends. I think that's good for him to experience firsthand without me interfering. So,
that's interesting. What about like just it's ethically wrong? Would you have that conversation with him?
no,
Wow,
that
really?
they don't understand ethically wrong, and ethics are very subjective. I'll give you a quick example of what I think. I don't really believe in ethics. I believe in principles. So to me, ethics is like trying to control a kid's behavior versus trying to understand what's actually going on in their head that created that behavior. So I'll just give you a quick example. So it's unethical for a professor to date their student, right? That's some ethical thing. What if that was the love of your life? I think they should date, right? So I'm just saying, like,
So,
there,
so yeah, because I said ethics, like it made it sound like I'm talking universally, but you've got this opinion of theory of knowledge, right? So maybe a more accurate thing would be like, do you think that this is against your ethics, or do you think this is against your principles, right? Like, do you want to steal? Do you think that's okay? Would you have this kind of a conversation with your
not really,
child?
because he has stolen. So obviously it's not against some principle. So all I
But
do
they
is,
might not have thought about it in a particular way. Like you get this in society all the time. A good example is like drug taking. Like you just find people that have not thought that this might be ethically wrong, and then you can have that conversation, and then they get a new perspective, and then they change their behavior. Now, that's not like important because you've like controlled someone, but it's important because you've brought them to a realization of their own opinion on their own behavior. And I feel like that would be part of parenting. Like, no?
definitely provide a viewpoint, but in terms of, I think, ethically or principle is probably too abstract for him at his age, but consequences are very real.
Right, okay. That's interesting. It's hard to know inside myself why I do things and why I don't do things, right? So, yeah, if I lie and if I cheat, I'll lose my friends, but I also just believe it's not right to do. And it's hard to know what the more compelling reason is inside me for me to not do that, right?
Yeah,
And I think that you want to believe that the reason why you don't do bad things is because they're bad and I'm not bad, right?
yeah.
But maybe it's more consequence based than I like to realize. But I don't know if I'm falling into this like apprenticeship thing that you're talking about earlier, but I feel like my compulsion is to talk about what's right and to say your gain in theft is another person's loss that they don't deserve. Like that's just straight where my mind goes to. It's like they probably haven't thought of that because that's not obvious necessarily. Like they're just thinking,
Yeah.
"Oh, sick, I got this," and I won the game of getting it without them knowing. So you need to like kind of inform that that perspective is not the only one, and you can think about it from the
Yeah, I
other
think
person's
they
perspective.
only, I mean, as I said, he's still a child, so they only relate to it in terms of how would they feel if that happened to them kind of thing, or that they would lose friends. I think even the how would you feel if you were them doesn't work either. It's just
Mm.
about all the consequences to you are if you get busted, you are going to literally lose that friend and or
But
lose
doesn't that
friends.
encourage them to just not get busted?
What's that?
Doesn't that just encourage them to not get busted?
Possibly, possibly.
Yeah, but you're kind of okay with that. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
But also too, it goes back to your definition of a child too, and I do inherently think people are good. It's just the environment, high pressure environment, external forces often make people desperate or do bad things. Of course, there are bad people, but generally, I think most people are quite good at heart. Their environment puts a lot of pressure on them to like turn into dog eat dog, and like to turn
Yeah.
into survival mode, which brings out bad behavior.
On that subject. So I think so. My partner is Chinese, and as you might know, Chinese education culture is like a million light years even further in the direction of authoritarian work all the time, work in the mines than the Australian education system. But a reason a lot of people go along with that, even though I would say that childhood in China is kind of child abuse on an enormous scale by any definition. People go along with that because of the fear of competition and the fear that their child will not survive in the dog eat dog world. Now, Australia is different, right? You will have a higher probability of being okay, even if somehow this experiment just goes sideways and you end up really missing out on education somehow that you would have gotten otherwise. Are you I mean, I imagine you're not too worried about that. Is that because you have confidence that you will deliver a very good education, or that like maybe the risks aren't so high in this country, or like are you worried about that kind of dog eat dog endpoint, or you think there's a way around it? There are niches you can exist in that aren't like that, and
Me, it's a bit of a it's I would say if I am worried about it, it's fear based rather than, actually how I think. I think that, we talked about the prepubescent, post-pubescent. I think I will be preparing him for the world. Pre, I think that definitely based on my experience that when you're not properly formed as a child. Now, one of the main reasons, which I didn't talk about because I thought it was too controversial, one of the reasons I decided on homeschooling and not to put him in the school system is I have worked with thousands of dysfunctional adults, and I was dysfunctional. And so you have these non-properly formed adults who are in this dog-eat-dog world, and they're insecure, they're dissatisfied, there's substance abuse. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So I feel like if you have that childhood years very protected, they absolutely know who they are, they know what they're interested in, they've had this lovely, wonderful environment. That's a really strong basis for facing the dog-eat-dog world and them interacting with it, because they never question themselves, as in, I'm not talking about, I'm just saying that they're very solid in their base. So you give them this really solid foundation, and they're not so easily swayed or influenced or those sort of things. And yes, it's hard to go into the dog eat dog world, but Will and I talked about this, which is totally not related to homeschooling. This comes really down to parenting more than anything, I think, which is, there are people who have like not hundreds of kids. Like, I'm exaggerating. A girl I work with, for example, has 7 children. They're not rich. She goes to work full time. She goes to the gym as well. And her and her husband like watching movies at night. It's like, I'm sorry, but when do your children get the attention that they need? And you obviously can't set them up financially. So as soon as they're 18, they're out the door fending for themselves. Whereas my husband and I had a very different view, which is we also want to be financially available for Bucky. So I don't, when you have a strong, solid financial base as a family as well, they're not so subject to now they're fending for themselves and working 2 jobs or crappy jobs to get through uni and all this sort of stuff. So I think that, I have very strong, even stronger views about parenting than I do about education, about what your actual responsibilities are. So letting a child loose at 18 into the world and just fending for themselves, I think is negligent. I actually think that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that's a good answer.
So then lastly, there's just a few myths that I guess I don't believe. So it's just whether this is parenting or education, but people talk a lot about stuff, and there's things that I just came at that I came to the realization I don't believe. So one of them is around this: kids need routine. I don't think they need routine. I think they need stability. So if you have like a harmonious environment and you have parents whose relationship is harmonious and you're not always changing your philosophy or taking them here and there, I think that that's way more essential. Once they have the stability and emotional and physical stability, then you don't need a routine at all. I have found he doesn't need a routine at all. When I looked at like schools, they talked. So as I said, I was a reluctant homeschooler, so I did do a lot of research around schools. And there's a lot of schools that say things like, "We're going to teach your kid how to learn. We're going to teach your kid love of learning, and I'm going to teach a child." And other ones are like, "I'm going to teach them how to think." And I'm like, actually, they already know all of that. So again, what does your child arrive with? I think they fully understand all that already. And in fact, we usually interfere with them. And actually, it's lucky that they don't put them in an education system before they've learnt their first language, because we'd probably stuff that up as well. So the next thing was, we've talked about this quite a lot, sorry. But yeah, kids need to work to prepare themselves for adult life. And, I've had a mother say to me, she was a bit concerned about her 6-year-old because he wasn't showing any interest in sort of paper-based learning or academics. And some kids are and some kids aren't, but he wasn't. And she said, "Oh, I'm a bit worried. I don't know, how will he fit into adult life?" And I'm like, well, what does a 6-year-old need now? And that's all you need to concern yourself with. So, I mean, I'll give you some examples of Bucky. Like, when I thought I had to do the curriculum, I was trying to teach him to read. And homeschool kids, this is rarely consistent. They either learn at 2 because they're really switched on academically, sort of like they're paper-based learners. And then the rest of them kind of pick it up around 8 to 10 years old. And so when I talked to him about learning reading, he goes, "Why?" He said, "Reading's inefficient. Audiobooks are much more efficient. And any child, I'm not allowed outside adult company. So why would I need to learn to read? They'll just read for me." I'm like, I can't argue with that reasoning, right? So therefore, I just put it aside. I'm like, that's a really good reason.
That's a pretty solid argument, yeah.
Yeah. The next one is around, so dependence is bad and independence is good. So again, you hear this a lot from schooling, and I would just say it's really individual. Like pretty much as soon as Bucky gets his first girlfriend, he's going to be independent. We're just going to see the back of him going out the door, right? So it happens naturally. And the reason I have thought about this is because he was extremely dependent on me for many years. He still is. And people think that that's bad. And for example, he went, when he was at school, they did a school camp for 4 days. And so we kind of, it was very important to their approach to learning. So and it was compulsory. So we kind of had to talk him into just giving it a go. He hated it. In fact, when he got back from it, he said, I don't want to ever be away from you again overnight, not just overnight, not during the day, overnight. And he asked the school to pay for his counselling. And I'm like, he didn't have counselling, but that's what he asked the school. He said, "I now need counselling and I want you to pay for it."
What a What an amazing kid to articulate that.
I just laughed. I'm just like going, oh my God. So yeah, the whole independence, dependence thing, it's just like it happens naturally when they're 18. They really don't want to hang out with mum and dad. It'll happen naturally. The next one is around kids being happy versus satisfied. So if you ask parents, what do you want for your child? Most of them would respond with, I want them to be happy. I think satisfaction is a much better thing to be. There's a lot of dissatisfied adults, and people might not be able to see the difference, but you have to work out what satisfies you, and anything that's satisfying often involves a lot of endeavor. So the thing that satisfies him is when he has his own idea and we actually put it into practice. Like he like at the moment he's doing a cooking show and he's got a character and all this sort of stuff. And he's setting up his YouTube channel. I found he's most satisfied when he actually executes his own ideas. Now, a lot of times he can't be bothered, and I try and help him be bothered because I know the end result is he loves it. And recently he did like a musical theatre play where they had input into their own characters, what they look like, costuming, the actual storyline and the script. And again, it's hard work and occasionally he couldn't be bothered, but we persisted with it. And he performed it and he loved it. So yeah, to me, if you're satisfied and you take that through to adulthood, I feel like I've done a good job, basically. What makes him happy is sitting on YouTube, watching videos. But then at the end of the day, he's really pissed off. And in fact, a lot of times he's come to me and said, I feel so bad. I'm doing nothing with my life, So that's my job, is to kind of get him through the despondency sometimes to get him to the other side.
Sounds like a PhD supervisor.
Yeah, I felt that familiarity.
The next one is that there's a belief that competition is great. Now, this is nothing to do with me. I've read a lot about this, and it's pretty well known that if you set people in competition, so the music contest or even when artists get commissioned work, it actually creates a suboptimal result. And this is actually really well researched and documented. So I think that having peers is really important. Not only peers that are different to you, but clever peers, who challenge you. And also facilitation is really important. And maybe I don't actually offer much feedback unless he asks for it, but he does ask for it a lot. So I think those are important, but setting people into competition with each other, I don't think really it actually creates a detrimental result, because it creates a proxy in their head, which is to beat someone else, not to actually create something that they're really happy with. This is probably linked, but, we don't do any external motivation. So, this is a lot of schools do rewards, grades, comparing to others, ranking kids and stuff like that. So our only question is, to him is when he's done something, he gets so many certificates that I've hidden, because it's like, I know you got a certificate for that drama class, but did you actually enjoy it? Like, is it something you want to continue doing? And so that's the simple question we ask when he's done an activity or does some classes or whatever. So same with programming or anything like that. It's like, do you actually enjoy this, or do you find it rewarding? Don't worry about the certificate you got or the mark you got, an A+ or whatever. And so I think this is really important too in your approach to facilitation. So for example, he wanted to learn how to spell. So we've been doing a bit of spelling, and at school he would get graded, but I refuse to grade him. But what I will do is recommend well-written books. If his grammar's off, well-written books. And then when you're reading them, you see the grammar and you see the spelling. And then I think that's me facilitating him learning how to spell and learning good grammar, that sort of thing. But, giving him a B, I just don't really see the point of that.
I'm interested in there's a kind of philosophy there. I wonder if you can articulate. So I mean, providing like a signal to correct yourself against could be seen as a good thing, but I mean, what you seem to be providing is a signal, but it's kind of sufficiently far removed that you can't really, like, I mean, people can too narrowly focus on the reward signal that comes from these kinds of feedback, and they're in some sense shallow and easy to mistake for the true thing you're trying to aim at.
Yeah.
You seem to be consistently pulling that back and like always pulling it further and further back so that you in some sense have to try and do the real thing. Is that what you're thinking about, or is it more like you just really don't want to provide the like the delivery of the feedback that's somehow the thing that you're trying to avoid?
No, I mean, I think it's about the real thing. So yeah, and also like the auto correction. So as I said, if you provide an environment that's intellectual, that, you know, there's body of knowledge that you've curated that you think is pretty accurate compared to the garbage wherever, then yeah, he once he's immersed in that environment, then he picks it up naturally. But in terms of activities, sorry, I've just got a cough. In terms of activities, so that's intellectual progress. But in terms of activities, I literally just want to know, did you enjoy that? Not because you got a fancy certificate. It's quite funny. I don't know why he did this, but we did drama. They handed out certificates, and he got told off by the teacher for some reason. And he just went right up to her face and ripped the certificate and yeah, and walked off. It's like,
your kids got style, that's for sure.
you learned good acting. That's a pretty dramatic show there. Glad we got something out of the class. She was so shocked. I was just like, sorry.
Yeah.
Tell him he can express himself how he feels. He's off right now. Yeah. That's pretty much it. I think I talked about living the principles. So and I don't only mean like you can't be a hypocrite, but what I'm teaching him is to be himself, to know who he is. So I can't then ignore that. I have to absolutely live like that. So so it's been interesting for me learning to homeschool, because what it's done is it's brought me much more in line with my own life. So I only do activities I enjoy. I don't do things out of obligation. I've got rid of friends who I didn't need anymore. So you have to live exactly according to the principles you're trying to teach, or it just doesn't work really. I never do activities I don't enjoy anymore. So I've changed quite a bit as well. And he, you know, I'm not just mum who's, a lot of people martyr their lives to their children, and I'm definitely not that. I've got my own purpose. I've got my own hobbies. I have my own identity, and he's very clear about that as well. And I've got my own boundaries, you know. So yes, he can express himself freely, but, you know, there's three of us living here and we all have to live together, and, you know, that noise is annoying the hell out of me, so stop it.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really very useful directly for me. I guess we should wrap up soon, but are there any questions, maybe from those of you who haven't been asking questions, if you have questions in the chat? Yeah, you'll be ready later, Chad.
The only thing I didn't really go across is like my I guess why I don't agree with the schooling system. That's a very lengthy topic, and there's a lot of really well written books about it and where it came from, and, you know, where modern day education came from, which I have done a pretty thorough research of. So yeah, but honestly, that's a really long topic.
Can I ask one question on that topic? So something really interesting happened to me. This happened a few years ago. I met a teacher, and I had this conversation with them. I was like, man, how do you feel about the school system? And we're like doing all of that. And she said that, yeah, it used to be really bad, and it was like set up to like basically generate workers for when they were older, and like whatever, all the opinions I'm sure that you have. But she was like, that's changing at the moment, and they're very concrete about this, and they're very explicit about it. And at one point, because we had this conversation a lot, so at one point when we met, she brought a textbook from her university course, right? And she opened up to a page that said, like, the history of schooling is that it came from this like desire to create a force, and this is not like the goal of modern day teaching, and and it's not meant to be like this anymore. So I was really kind of surprised by this. I was like, okay, this is the textbook that is like the standard textbook for this class, which is a university class for teachers. And it like explicitly said that this is what school used to be, and we don't want it to be like that anymore. So maybe it's the case that a lot has changed over the last period of time, which is the period of time that you've been homeschooling Bucky for, right? So have you refreshed your opinions and kept up to date with how society has changed over that period? Or was it more like when you first did your research, you realized the school system was not what you wanted to put your kid through, and then you kind of didn't turn back after that
Yeah.
decision?
So I would say if you look at my first two principles, putting a kid in the world and following their interests, that's not achievable in any school actually. Because the whole the schooling is en masse, and you can't individually have a conversation with a child. And also you can't have them out in the world. You're essentially babysitting them in a closed environment. The way in which they have catered to children a bit more lately, to answer your question, Bucky was in school for 2 years, and I didn't agree with what they're learning. I think most of primary school is a waste of time. That's just my honest opinion. And then when you get into senior school, it becomes more relevant or more useful. So I did have exposure to it, and again, it's just ACT. I don't think much has changed. It's like putting lipstick on a pig is how I would describe it. The only thing they cater for a little bit more is identifying that kids learn in slightly different ways, and therefore they might approach different children differently, or not push the point on certain children but other people. Whereas in the old days, it was just generic. You face the teacher, it's on the board, and you have to do this now. So I'd say that they cater for different learning styles, but that still does not mean that you are in any way following anything that you're interested in. They can't achieve that in the school system. I think a lot of schools, modern day school system is really dumbed down to the point that it's inaccurate actually. It's so simplistic, it's inaccurate, and it really caters for the middle road. So again, depending on where your child's at, they could be bored their whole life, or they could be engaged. There's actually a really well-written book. A guy who was he's a physicist. He worked for NASA. He went to a private school in Sydney. He's homeschooled his two children. His wife is a professor. His daughter, who I think she started uni at 15. She's very clever. He talked about this book, and it's basically saying if your IQ is 30 points higher than your primary school teacher, school is actually traumatic for you. It creates a traumatic experience. And so they can talk about changes all they like, but it's so minor and not impactful. Kids don't still get time to do, if you go back over my whole principles, knowing yourself, exploring your own interests, all that stuff. None of that is catered for in any way. I was just going to say, whilst he was at school, the pandemic hit, I decided I'd do his schoolwork for him because he just was not interested in all, and I think it's mostly a waste of time. So I did all his schoolwork mainly, and I just found it completely, I would say it's worse. As in, when I went through school, it was a little bit intellectual. Now it's just so dumbed down for the average. To me, the average is lower.
Yeah, I feel like I
have to
know it.
agree.
I had a tutoring student a few years ago. They were doing some like new IT class that they had incorporated into a school, and they were really excited over it because they thought it was like the world changing and understanding that code is important to know. So they've introduced classes for it inside high school. And I remember really struggling to teach this student because I went through his textbook, which was this small thing, and it was completely void of content. You know, it was just like this meandering, like rambling stuff of like the generic benefits of IT without any specification, any detail, anything hard or anything relevant. And I remember having kind of the same feeling where I was like, this is so simple that it's meaningless, you know? Like it doesn't have any
Absolutely. And it's
anything.
interesting. So one of the hardest parts of homeschool is actually finding resources that are actually good quality. And so in terms of
Yeah.
English, I went back to a guy called Webster, Noah Webster. He had so I thought what I learned was what when were people the most literate in the US? And it turns out, say 150, 200 years ago. Of course, there are people who never got educated, but I'm talking about people who supposedly had some sort of education. Their literacy rate was the highest back then, and he had this Webster's syllabary, I call it. And now they're teaching English as a phonetic language and all this sort of stuff, which is just not. And so they found that when they did the Vietnam War, so the literacy, sorry, was around 98% of whatever test they use. They applied the same test during the Vietnam War and their literacy was, say, 61%. They thought people were bullshitting the test result to get out of going. They couldn't even read basic instructions. These are people who've been through the school system. So, yeah, it's just interesting, like a lot, the way in which things are taught. I have so many objections to. I think that they're simplistic, fundamentally flawed. And so I've really tried to find ways of doing things differently. And you often have to go back 200 years or something to find an effective tool for teaching basic things. So basic numeracy and literacy.
Yes, very old textbooks are a great resource. I think we should wrap it up here, but Billy, I would be very interested to hear the rest of the things you have to say. So maybe at some point, if you don't mind, you could come back and talk about that. This has been very enlightening.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I hope you got something out of it.
No, I did.
Yeah, I'm sure we all did.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And see you all next time.